So without further ado, let's kick off with our first keynote presenter. Extremely in awe of this gentleman, and just absolutely delighted that we have Professor Ian Lowe joining us this year. So Professor Lowe is the Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Griffith University. He's President of the Australian Conservation Foundation and a Fellow of the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. Ian was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2001 for services to science and technology, especially environmental science. In 2000, he received the Prime Minister's Environmental Award for Outstanding Individual Achievement and the Queensland Premier's Millennium Award for Excellence in Science. And I'm not kidding when I say there are so many more accolades and things that I could say about this man that it would take me another 5 to 10 minutes. But without going on too much, can I please say I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Ian Lowe to the stage. Please give him a huge round of applause.
Thank you very much both for the invitation and the very generous introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on and pay my respect to their elders past and present. Paying respect to elders is not an integral part of whitefella tradition, but I have to say the idea appeals to me more as I totter unsteadily into that category myself. My basic message is that acknowledging the traditional owners is now a bit of a ritual, and even coalition ministers usually remember to do it, but it should be more than a ritual, particularly if we're talking about sustainability. Because if you think about it, the original Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years that for a society to endure, it needs to have customs and practice and a system of law that allows them to live in balance with natural systems. And that really is the message of sustainability, that we need customs and practice and a system of law that allows us to live in balance. And at the moment we are palpably not living in balance. And my message essentially is that sustainability is so important, it should be an integral part of everyone's education. When I studied at the University of New South Wales back in the Triassic, they had the idea that if you studied science or applied sciences or engineering, you should also study the humanities, because the university's first Vice-Chancellor, who had some odd ideas, but we should have not just nuclear energy but nuclear weapons to defend ourselves, but he also believed that you shouldn't be able to become a professional technocrat and be ignorant of the society and culture in which you live. And I think we could make the stronger argument today that whether people are studying law or commerce or accountancy, whatever they're studying, they should understand that their choices affect whether we will have a sustainable future or not. It's a lesson that Tony Keynote clearly doesn't understand. He thinks that politicians can stop boats and hold back the tsunami of evidence about climate change, or hold back the will of the community. Interestingly, when the Coalition were elected in Queensland, the first thing they did was scrap the Premier's Literary Awards, and the immediate response was that the community funded the Literary Awards. The old adage is when the people lead, leaders eventually follow. And the sustainability revolution is being led by the community, and sooner or later our leaders will have to catch up with us. 25 years ago I spent a year directing Australia's Commission for the Future, back when we had the idea that you were more likely to have the future you wanted if you thought about it, rather than trusting the magic of the market or the generosity of international corporations. And its motto was, the future is not somewhere we're going, it's something we are creating. There is not one inevitable future to which we are propelled by the laws of Newtonian mechanics or the dodgy laws of economics. There are a whole range of possible futures, and which one happens will be the product of the decisions and actions we make as individuals, as members of groups, as members of the community. I think it's a self-evident ethical principle that we should be trying to shape a future that is at least in principle sustainable, one that can be sustained, if not forever, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, these days it's almost impossible to find a politician who will admit to not being in favour of sustainable development, but a lot of the thinking is very woolly. and it seems to be that we only need to change a few light bulbs and fund a few more big roads and we'll have sustainable development. In 1996, when the previous coalition Commonwealth government took office, over the next year or so I was systematically disappointed from all of the advisory bodies to which I'd been appointed by previous governments, and I despaired of ever again being asked to advise the Commonwealth government about anything. So I imagined that I'd been commissioned by the new Ministry for Unsustainable Futures to give advice on how we could ensure that the future was not sustainable. Now, you may find it difficult to believe that any government, even one run by Tony Keynote, could be in favour of an unsustainable future, but suspend your disbelief for a moment while I go through this thought experiment. What would you do if you wanted to create unsustainable futures? I'd suggest the first thing you do would be to have rapid population growth, because we know that no species can expand without limit in a closed system. If population isn't stabilised by methods that are socially acceptable, it will be stabilised by starvation and disease and fighting amongst ourselves. And if the rate of population growth is not sufficiently rapid, perhaps you could encourage people to have more children by financial incentives or facile slogans like one for mum, one for dad, one for Peter Costello. And increasing levels of migration to previously unprecedented highs. If you wanted to compound the impact of a rapidly growing population, you could have increasing consumption per person and celebrate the fact that we now use twice as much energy per person as we did 20 years ago. We now have the largest new houses of any country in the world, a great achievement. And of course, if you have both more people and more consumption per person, you are putting compounding pressure on natural systems and on resources. In terms of resources, maybe you could deplete significant mineral resources. Oil would be a good one to start with. And if you wanted to ensure that had maximum social impact, you could base your transport system around an implicit presumption that there will always be cheap petroleum fuels. And so the best way to ensure mobility is to build larger and larger freeways to encourage people to drive one to a car, and perhaps have tax subsidies for large four-wheel drive vehicles, which one of my friends call urban assault vehicles, to allow people to cope with the difficult terrain of suburban streets. What else could you do? Well, you could overuse renewable resources like fisheries and forests and water so that future generations don't have them in the same quantity that we take for granted. You could maybe do significant environmental damage, perhaps disrupt the climate, maybe lose biodiversity. What else could you do? Well, you could base your entire economy around a presumption that every year you will ship larger and larger quantities of low-value commodities overseas using the cheap transport fuels, which will be available forever, to pay for the things that we're not clever enough to make for ourselves, like T-shirts and sand shoes. In social terms, you could widen inequality. Embracing globalisation would be a good way of doing that, because it drives managerial salaries up to telephone numbers to give us the world's best managerial talent, which accounts for success stories like OneTel and HIH and Telstra. And at the same time, it depresses wages in labour-intensive areas to compete with third-world sweatshops. And if you wanted to compound the impact of widening income inequality, you could steadily run down the public provision of essential services like health and education and transport in favour of a private provider model, so that those with heavy wallets had more choices and those of more modest means had fewer choices. And perhaps finally, as a spiritual basis for society, you could embrace crass materialism and encourage people to believe they'll be more fulfilled if they have the largest four-wheel drive or the biggest plasma screen in the street. Or perhaps lurch back to a primitive fundamentalism in which ancient texts written thousands of years ago are seen as literally true and a good guide to life in the modern world. I won't insult your intelligence by going through all of those one by one, but I will make the observation that if a visitor from another galaxy happened upon our civilization, they would conclude that we had all the policy settings that you would put in place if you wanted to ensure that the future was not sustainable. The point I'm making is that a sustainable future involves significant change, and we have to accept that in arguing for a sustainable future, we need to be courageous because we are challenging some very fundamental assumptions, like the fact that you can have unlimited growth in a closed system. At one level, there's nothing new about what I've said. There's now been 4 reports in the UNEP series on the global environmental outlook, and the second one said, our present course is unsustainable, postponing action is no longer an option. although it was the universal response to the report. I've said that our position is a bit like this picture, that our politicians concentrate on the road ahead and make little decisions about steering the economy, oblivious to the large problems which are coming up behind. And if you can't read the fine print, it says, objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. I'll just underline a couple of the points and then draw your attention to some recent reports and the tsunami of evidence that's building up that we need to change fundamentally, and then talk about what that means for education. This is a graph showing the discovery of large oil fields. Not much of a pattern there, so it could have escaped the attention of decision makers that it did peak and subsequently decline. This is the most recent graph from the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, showing that conventional oil production has already peaked and is declining. Overall production is being expanded by gas condensates, oil from deep water, and of course there's no technical or environmental problems with that, oil from polar regions, and heavy oil, which of course comes at a significant environmental cost. But the overall peak is expected to be sometime in the next 5 years, and after that it's downhill all the way. The consequences are that transport fuels will, if there is an orderly market and people play nicely, just become steadily more expensive, but in the real world supply disruptions will become increasingly likely. This doesn't just have impacts on our capacity to move ourselves around, but the entire system of food production and distribution is critically dependent on petroleum fuels, as is our entire system of manufacturing and distribution. Everything that you wear, everything that you eat, everything that you use was brought to you by transport fuels. And as transport fuels become more expensive and scarcer, we will see significant disruptions of many aspects of modern life. But we go on planning as if cheap transport fuels will be here forever. This is a schematic diagram of a proposed new interchange on the Sunshine Coast to allow people to drive effortlessly using the limitless transport fuels. Let me say something about what are usually called environmental issues. I prefer to use the word ecological because environment suggests surroundings of which we are not part. But we are just as much part of the ecological system as gum trees or galahs or goannas. Like them, we depend on natural systems for our sustenance. We depend on natural systems to process our waste. This is the bottom line, the total ecological footprint of humanity. When I was an undergraduate, we were consuming about half of the sustainable productivity of natural systems. We're now consuming about 125%. In other words, we are operating at an ecological deficit. And in this age of fiscal rectitude, where it's almost a hanging offence for a government to have a fiscal deficit, it's surprising that we are as sanguine as we are about the ecological deficit, which is much more likely to put burdens on future generations than a fiscal deficit, particularly if it was borrowing to invest in a sustainable future. The fourth report on the Global Environmental Outlook documented unprecedented environmental change at global and regional levels, climate change, unsustainable land use, aquatic ecosystems heavily exploited, water availability declining globally, and in biological terms, almost all well-studied species are declining in distribution or abundance or both. In fact, we are now in the 6th major extinction event in human history. We are losing species at rates comparable with the Great Extinction at the end of the Carboniferous, and we just don't know what the consequences will be for future human survival. I don't want to depress you, but the Millennium Assessment Report went on to say there's established but incomplete evidence that our impacts on ecosystems are increasing the likelihood of non-linear changes with important consequences for human well-being. And the Millennium Assessment documented half a dozen examples of non-linear change. One of the best known is the Newfoundland cod fishery, which was harvested more or less sustainably at about 100 to 200,000 tonnes a year for about 100 years, until better technology made it possible briefly to catch about 3 times as much fish. The fishery collapsed, had a minor revival, and then collapsed completely. Natural systems are often non-linear, and if pushed beyond critical thresholds, can change rapidly and effectively irreversibly to new stable states, which will be much less suitable for human survival. I feel I should say something about climate change. Despite Tony Knuth's denial, it is getting warmer, and human activity is the main cause. Just to remind you how recent is concern, a friend sent me this advertisement which appeared in magazines when I was an undergraduate, and Humble Oil paid good money to say proudly, "Each day Humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tonnes of glacier." It is true, as the deniers sometimes say, that there have been significant changes in climate throughout human history. This graph of the Holocene shows the so-called Holocene optimum, when it was significantly warmer, the medieval warm period when the Vikings were in Greenland, and the Little Ice Age in Europe when Shakespeare wrote of milk coming frozen home in pail. But if you look at the scale on the left, those excursions to the medieval warm period or the Little Ice Age are less than a degree, about half a degree difference from the average of the last 10,000 years. We are now 0.7 degrees above the average of the last 10,000 years and increasing at a rate of knots. The Academy of Science summarised what we know about climate and said that you can look at fossil carbon dioxide emissions and changes in temperature and sketch out two futures. One is business as usual, the Campbell, Newman, Barry-O'Farrell future, in which we can export unlimited quantities of coal with a clear conscience and not worry about the consequences. The consequences are this band of red graphs, which are the credible range of estimates of the increase in global temperature if we follow that path of fossil carbon dioxide emissions. And it averages about 5 degrees increase in average global temperature. And I'd remind you that the Earth's average temperature has increased about 0.8 of a degree in the last 100 years, but the temperature in Central Australia has increased by somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. 5 degrees average doesn't mean 5 degrees everywhere. It means less than that in some places and more than that in others. Essentially, it means significant areas of the Earth will be uninhabitable. There is a better future which involves scaling back fossil emissions and perhaps containing the rise in temperature to about double what we've seen so far. The Academy's summary is to have a better than even chance of keeping the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees. The world would need to be emitting less than half the 2000 amount of carbon dioxide by 2050. So global emissions need to peak within the next 10 years and then decline rapidly. That's why the International Energy Agency, which is composed of the fossil fuel industries as well as the much smaller industries that provide clean energy, said in their World Energy Outlook in 2008, the world needs nothing short of an energy revolution in which you use much cleaner energy and turn it much more efficiently into the goods and services that people want. I was talking to David Hood earlier about Amory Lovins, who famously said, people don't want energy, they want hot showers and cold beer. And the technical challenge is to provide hot showers and cold beer while doing significantly less damage to the environment than we now do. The good news is that renewable resources are huge compared with any conceivable scale of human energy demand. The sun supplies energy to the Earth at about 10,000 times the rate of human energy use. Or one number that I remember to illustrate this, the amount of solar energy that hits Australia alone in one summer day alone is about half the total global annual energy use. I'll say that again because most people have difficulty believing it. All 7 billion humans in an entire year for all purposes, cooking, heating, lighting, transport, washing, total global annual energy use is about twice the solar energy that hits Australia in one summer day. The challenge is to convert just a tiny fraction of those renewable energy flows to meet our needs. And there are now quite respectable studies done by the University of Melbourne and the University of New South Wales, among others, that show that we could, within 10 or 15 years, be supplying all of our energy needs from a mix of renewables at a cost that isn't much more than the current subsidy of fossil fuel supply and use. I want to draw your attention to two recent reports. The 2012 report of the United Nations Secretary-General's High-Level Panel on Global Sustainability, Resilient People, Resilient Planet. Summary of key issues, no news here. Unprecedented prosperity, but the planet under unprecedented stress. And despite the unprecedented prosperity, more than 1 billion people still live in poverty, 500 million don't have enough to eat, 1 billion don't have clean drinking water, 2 billion don't have sanitation. And they said the development model is unsustainable. And there is a new nexus of food, water and energy which need to be considered together. We need integrated thinking that understands that food production requires water and energy, that energy production requires water, and so on. And we need new sustainability indicators so decisions are based on science rather than closing down bodies that supply advice on science. They said by embracing a new approach to the political economy of sustainable development, we will bring the sustainable development paradigm from the margins to the mainstream of the global economic debate. So the cost of action and the cost of inaction will become transparent. This is not greenie radicals. This is not left-wingers with a gin and tonic too many at closing time. These are leaders of the global community on the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on sustainability. The second report I wanted to draw your attention to is one on resource efficiency, economics and outlook for Asia and the Pacific, produced for UNEP by CSIRO in collaboration with other research bodies. I was one of the reviewers, and the report said that the last 35 years have seen the most rapid growth in natural resource use in the history of Asia and the Pacific, unprecedented economic development and progress in most of the countries, but also greater environmental pressures, larger greenhouse gas emissions, lower resource and energy efficiency, rising consumer waste. And they said today's pattern of production and consumption are broaching the limits of what the planet can supply and sustain. There are pressures arising from the scarcity of water, land, food, nutrients, oil and strategic materials. And they concluded that a new industrial revolution that uses far less energy, water and raw materials is becoming essential in the face of emerging global uncertainties in resource supply, economics, environmental change and climate change. Well, they were scientists, I hear you say, but let me give you Exhibit C. The World Economic Forum is the big end of town at a global level. It hosts the annual Love-In at Davos, at which prime ministers and finance ministers go and chat about whether the rate of economic growth will be 2.1% or 2.2% next year. The World Economic Forum had a summit on the global agenda in 2008, and their concluding statement said, among other things, the recent crises of fuel, food and finance are simply the three canaries in the mine, the early warning signals that our current economic system is simply not sustainable. Not that there are resource issues, not that there are environmental issues, but the current economic system is simply not sustainable. Again, not greenie academics, not left-wing agitators, but the big end of town at the global level, saying the economic system is not sustainable. Limits to Growth was published 40 years ago, and it said that if the growth trends in population, resource use, industrial production, agricultural output and pollution were all to continue, we would reach limits within 100 years, and the most likely result would be significant decline in social, economic and environmental systems in the early to middle decades of this century. Well, Dr. Graham Turner of CSIRO has compared the Limits to Growth report with 30 years of data, and on all those key parameters we are tracking the standard run, which leads to economic and ecological collapse before 2050. Now, of course, no one has to change. Survival is optional, but I think it's a pretty good option. What are the responses to this tsunami of information that we are not living sustainably and that a sustainable future will involve significant change? Richard Eckersley has documented 3 alternative responses. The first, he says, denial. John Kenneth Galbraith famously said, faced with a need for change, decision makers will often try to prove that change is not necessary. And if they're in government, commission a consultant to tell them that change is not necessary. And if the consultant is telling you that change is necessary, then you abolish that consultant and find another one. That great sage Woody Allen said, don't underestimate the power of distraction. You can avoid the problem by staging bigger and bigger festivals, World Cups, fuel cars and drive them around in circles to see which one can go the fastest, and find people sufficiently degraded to pay money to watch the spectacle, and avoid the problem. And the third approach is one attributed to Margaret Reed: take responsibility for change, recognising that a small group of determined people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. If we're serious about sustainability, we need to recognise that the underlying drivers of unsustainable development are that the population is still growing, consumption per person is still increasing, and perhaps most fundamentally, societal values do not see those as problems, but see those as achievements. Dr. Paul Raskin, who heads the Telus Institute in Boston, has argued that the values which have driven progress for the last 100 years are domination of nature, individualism and consumerism. And those values, he said, are now fundamental obstacles to the goal of a sustainable society. And if we want a sustainable future, we have to have a new triad of values. Domination of nature needs to be replaced by what you could call ecological sensitivity, an awareness that our decisions have impacts on natural systems, and a willingness to live within the discernible boundaries of natural systems. Consumerism, the idea that you'll be more fulfilled if you spend more money and have more things in your house that you never use, and a hallmark of that is the growing industry of storage spaces, so that you can store the things that you have bought but don't have room for in your house. It needs to be replaced by an emphasis on the quality of life, the quality of the human experience. And finally, individualism, the rather dotty nation that we can paddle our own canoe in a world of 7 billion humans, needs to be replaced by a recognition that we're all in this together, that we share a fate with the rest of the human family, and we need to identify with their needs and find ways forward that involve the whole human community rather than just those of us who live a relatively privileged life in relatively affluent countries. So what does this mean for education? He said, looking nervously at his watch and realising that I've got about 5 minutes to tell you about education for sustainability. Above all else, we have to be preparing people for a world of rapid change. But I think that's a very mild ambition. I think we should be going further than that. We should be investing in our economic future. We should be enhancing our ability to assess complex ecosystems and human impacts. We should be developing technological options, not just equipping people to cope, but equipping people with the capacity and the willingness to shape the sort of future that they want. I used to tell people that you shouldn't be asking experts to tell you what the future will be like. You should be asking yourself what you want the future to be like, and then telling the experts that that's what you want, and their job is to provide that sort of future. So the cognitive basis of education for sustainability, I think, is relatively clear. We need to understand the impacts of human activities on natural systems. We need to be aware of the finite scale of non-renewable resources and the limits on the use of renewable resources. We need to understand the need for viable economies rather than running Ponzi schemes, and we need to understand the impacts of social inequality. We also need to understand the importance of cultural traditions, beliefs and practices, because that determines what is socially sustainable, what sort of solutions to our problems are politically viable. Again, there's nothing new about this. The OECD Centre for Educational Research and Innovation, in a report 25 years ago, said education should be enhancing behavioural dispositions such as cooperativeness, curiosity, initiative, responsibility and independence, as well as intellectual skills related to creativity, autonomous thinking and efficient problem solving. It would be going too far to say that the education system systematically suppresses those behavioural dispositions, but we don't do as much as we should to enhance them. I remind you that the etymology of the word education is the Latin educere, to lead out, not to cram in. And education is far too much today about cramming in and not nearly enough about leading people out of where they are into where they could be if we give them new capacities and new skills. The educationist Patricia Kelly, who happens to be my partner, argues that the target should be to move beyond Homo sapiens, which is both gendered and a link to our past, and see our goal as producing what she's called globo sapiens, wise citizens of the world, people who are marked by empathy, by global consciousness, global awareness, thinking beyond this generation, thinking about the generations to come, recognising that the decisions we make about energy supply and use, urban planning, transport, are literally setting in concrete what our options will be for 50 to 100 years. But alarmingly, they're mostly taken by people whose time horizon is this year's balance sheet or next year's election, unaware of the long-term consequences. They have to be willing to embrace change. I think Einstein said one of the definitions of insanity is doing what you've done before and expecting a different outcome. If we want a different outcome, we have to do things differently. And if you accept that the way we are developing now is not sustainable, a sustainable future has to include a willingness to embrace change. And finally, it requires courage, because all of the mainstream thinking, all of the media, most politicians are still locked in the delusion of unlimited growth in closed systems. And it does require courage to challenge those assumptions and point out that the emperor has no clothes. But it's something that I believe we have to do. Let me just finally touch on the issue of institutional operation. I chaired a committee that reported to the Queensland Minister for Education about 5 years ago about education for sustainability in Queensland schools. And we argued that the principles of sustainability should be part of the core curriculum, but we argued also that educational institutions need to reinforce those lessons by being models of sustainable development in their buildings, their energy and water use, their use of paper, and perhaps most importantly, in the way they manage the transport demands of staff and students. I noticed that there is a presentation about making transport to higher education more sustainable, because probably the largest carbon footprint of higher education is the transport of people to and from campuses. That's, I believe, part of our responsibility to ensure that our institutions reinforce and demonstrate in practice the lessons that are being taught in the classroom. The conference, A Just and Sustainable South Australia, 10 years ago, concluded that sustainability must be integrated as the driving principle of education across all sectors. It seems to me that the challenge is so important and so fundamental to our future that there is no excuse for allowing people to graduate in law or commerce or science for that matter, ignorant of the principles of sustainability and ignorant of the impacts of their choices on future generations. So in that sense, we are developing a new story. At the moment, it's a small and fragile plant, but great oaks from little acorns grow, or from little things, big things grow. It is the way of the future. And in that sense, education for sustainability, there is no alternative. Thank you very much.